back to Chat and Mel Movie Hour. It's been a minute, but if anything's going to bring us out of the woodwork, it's going to be Orson Welles and David Fincher. So here we are with our deep dive into Citizen Kane and Orwellian realness. Wait, did I say Orwellian? I meant Orson Welles realness.
It made sense anyway. Like when I heard it, I didn't even question it.
I can edit that out, but it does kind of
Leave
it.
Yeah.
I've been on Zoom since 7 a.m., y'all. Okay. All right. So without further ado, we're going to do a deep dive into the Orson Wellesian realness that is Citizen Kane. And cheers. Here we go. All right. So the movie came out in 1941, right?
Right.
We know, love this. RKO Studios produced it.
Orson directed, produced, and depending on who you believe, co-wrote it. And Herman J. Mankiewicz really did all the heavy lifting writing for it. And Orson Welles also stars in it and does an amazing job in that regard as well.
I still am having a hard time processing how young he was when this was happening. And 24, right? Or 25 when it came out?
Yes.
That's insane. He had already filmed. Oh, wait, sorry, you cut out. Go ahead.
No, it is totally insane. I'm so enamored with like his drive at that time and his ambition and the fact that he was able to get that coveted like creative freedom across the board from the studio, like contractually. Just incredible. Like just so it's so like such an inspirational story. And I'm so glad we're doing this movie because it's one of my favorite movies. But I really was like so in love with the idea of this movie before I saw the actual movie, because it's one of those movies that like when I was a kid, I would always hear about being on the top of like all those lists of like best films ever. So like whenever the 100 best films would come out, it would always be like number one. And that just already makes you want to see the movie if you're really into film like I was. And I think it sets the movie up to be a disappointment to people too in some ways. They're like, well, that's not the best movie. It's easy to say that, right? That it's not. But I mean, you have to put it in context of like when it came out, what they accomplished. Like, there's just a movie that I don't know where to start.
No, I mean, agreed. I mean, you're talking about a guy that by the time he was 24, had already put on an all-black production of Macbeth. We're talking early 40s. He had already done War of the Worlds, the radio broadcast, which just shook the nation and like changed the paradigm of like what was possible in terms of storytelling and kind of piercing the veil of like where reality meets fiction. And then he has license, like carte blanche, whatever the hell he wants with this movie, which would never happen today. So it was like a perfect storm of things. But yeah, I mean, to your point, like even when I rewatched it with you guys as a group recently, it was like this is the greatest film ever made. Like, but again, to your point, like it kind of is, and you have to separate the hype from what you're actually seeing. And if you put it in the context of the fact that it was produced in 1940 and circumstances under which it was written, I mean, it's absolutely a masterpiece. And it just, I'm just obsessed with Orson like more than ever right now. Like I just am reading everything I can. It's so delicious.
Me too. I was always so enamored with the story about War of the Worlds and what he did with that radio play of War of the Worlds, where he did it in such a way that everyone thought it was real. And at the time in our culture, it was totally believable that maybe there would be this like alien invasion because of like that being such an like a craze in Hollywood and just a lot of people being, I don't know, they were set up in this way with that radio show. And I just love that story so much. There's documentaries just about that, how that unfolded, and
Hmm.
how the highways were all congested, and people were getting their kids out from school and or wherever they were, and getting their family together and like trying to get out of the city. And they just totally believed it. And it's kind of makes me in a way, because like it would be so interesting to live in a time for just a little bit where you actually believe that was happening. Like, could you imagine? Because you would be like living an alien invasion for a short period until you found out it wasn't true. Uh,
And yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yes. I mean, it's crazy because I think something's interesting happening in like the zeitgeist right now, if you will, where the timing of Fincher revisiting this narrative with his production of Mank and Citizen Kane coming back into popular culture, and it being 2020, and we're living in this very dystopian moment in history, and you have a lot of alternative facts and fake news, and you have people that don't know how to separate reality from fiction. And to imagine if this kind of storytelling were to happen now, I feel like a lot of people would be just as gullible and buy into it, because it's preying on people. Ultimately, it's preying on people's fear. And that's, I think, part of why the radio broadcast was so successful. So I
absolutely.
just
Hysteria,
think it's,
and it's just compounded by like your neighbors are panicking, so then you feel like you have to panic, and it spreads, right? Just like viral.
yeah,
Yeah, amazing. But I think there's a lot of reasons why you could make the case that this is, if not the greatest film, certainly one of the greatest films ever made, Citizen Kane. And that's just because it's so technically proficient in so many ways, right? Like you have a really solid screen, but the filmmaking techniques, like the care and time and attention that they put into lighting and setting up a shot, and innovating like different ways to like move the camera so that it like moves through furniture, or um, lighting so that a transition would be a lot more interesting, and things that like are done commonly with green screen were done in this film, obviously not via green screen, but with lighting tech, and working with areas of the screen that would become black that could now transition to the next screen, because anything black on the screen was now the next shot, but the things that were still lit were not. So like the the fact that all that was so well thought out, I mean, it's just incredible. And the fact that you have these creative forces that are just like able to do exactly what they want to do on a high level, huge budget. And I mean, that's a dream in and of itself for anyone to get that ability. People still fight so hard for that. Most still don't get it. So for him to
yeah,
get such a young age, and yeah, it's an awesome story. But I feel like there's certain directors that have gotten that, like Stanley Kubrick has
yeah,
definitely commanded and gotten that. And look at the results of those type of situations when you have extremely creative, um, intelligent people working at that level without a lot of boundaries or restrictions. I mean, 2001: A Space Odyssey, stuff like that can happen. So
right.
yeah, I think anyway,
Yeah,
it's awesome.
pre-focus groups, placating to the audience and trying to manufacture something for dollars and cents only. And you brought up two things that I think are really good segues. Number one, the fact that he like the technical prowess that was going on, I want to get to, but the first thing you mentioned was how it's been on the top of, it's been number one on the top of these various prestigious lists of the top films of all time. And I was reading a couple articles, and I'll link them below, but they were mentioning how it over time has fluctuated actually up and down these lists.
Right.
Now, it Vertigo surpassed it, and then Shawshank Redemption is now kind of sitting at number one. But when the movie first came out, it was critically acclaimed, but it didn't get a lot of wide release because of Hearst wanting to not be smeared and protect his name.
Right.
And I was reading in this Vulture article that back then the studio, and I didn't know this, that the studios actually owned most of the movie theaters. So the distribution process was all like very political and wrapped up, and a lot of that has obviously since changed. But that had a lot to do, that combined with Hearst wanting to keep the movie from reaching everybody and protecting his name, really didn't reach a wide audience until after Hearst died, until after that that dynamic with the studios and the theaters died out. And then in the
Right.
50s, a lot of people got to see it. It got released on television. Martin Scorsese talks about the first time he saw it was on TV, and it's one of his favorite movies. And then it started making its way to the top of these very prestigious lists. But it's interesting that it's how it's moved up and down. But you were talking about the technical prowess, and one of the first things you said to me when we were about to rewatch the movie together was pay attention to the opening shot. And I think it's worth mentioning Greg Tolan, the cinematographer, who I want you to talk a little bit more about that scene, that window scene and the table scene.
Right.
But Orson Welles actually in the end credits shares the end credit title with Greg Tolan, which was unheard of and doesn't happen today anymore. And I guess Welles always spoke very highly of him and shared credit, where a lot of people imagine that Orson wouldn't be that generous.
Right. And yet in Mank, we learned, not to slide into Mank yet, because there's so much to say first. But yet in Mank, it's almost set up to say that, Orson was one of those suppressing Mank, get more credit for the screenplay. But it kind of flies in the face of the fact that he was so generous with Greg Tolan's credit. So I don't know. It's hard to know the truth of what happened all those years ago. And it was interesting when you were talking about Hearst. I was it's just so funny because obviously he was a newspaper, owned many newspapers, and was a tycoon. And he kept the mention of this film out of all of his papers. But it's more like an embarrassment and an ego thing in his crowds, the circles he runs in, right? But I wonder, like, if movie-going audiences really would have, like, how many of them would have really just been thinking about Hearst the whole film. I just don't see that. You know what I mean? And of course, they say it was actually like an amalgamation of Hearst and other tycoons from Chicago. But it would have been interesting to, I don't have enough knowledge to know like how obvious it would have been to a movie-going audience that this is about Hearst. But clearly there were personal things that really only Hearst would have known that may have into the movie, we don't know for sure, that were kind of personal digs against her.
Yeah.
It's more of Hearst's ego that I want to stamp out this film, not because someone's going to see it and recognize it as him, maybe, or maybe not, maybe a little bit of both. But I'm going to read a book called Citizen Kane, A Filmmaker's Journey, that I have on order that I'm very excited about. So I will have to discuss more, because Mank, I feel like, is one-sided issue, and this book maybe could be the other. But I'm definitely fascinated by Orson Welles, like, what a force. And I want to learn a lot more about him.
Yeah, you bring up something that I didn't had not occurred to me, like how much would a 1941 or even a 1950s audience, more so in the 50s, of course, because I think Hearst was obviously more well known, time had passed, but how well would a 1940s audience how aware would they have been of the fictionalized version versus like
Right.
this is really a direct dig at
Yeah.
Hearst.
Like
Because
obviously all of Hollywood knew, but they're more like in on things, you know? So once you get outside of Hollywood,
yeah.
things change a little bit.
Well, talk to us about the importance and like the just sheer effing majesty of the opening shot.
Yeah, so if you watch this film, and it so many things in this film will blow your mind in 2020. So the fact that it's like a 1941 film, or a 1940 film that came out in 41, it's just amazing. Like in the opening setup, we have a lot of dissolves that bring us closer and closer to Xanadu, which is the fictional uh, castle, basically, that our Kane lead character lives in and created. So not unlike Hearst Castle.
Right.
So as it's pushing in, though, they took the care to have the window that we eventually go up to and through. And that's a whole nother part. It always stays like in the upper right hand corner of the screen. So as each dissolve happens, we're going through different angles and obviously different distances, but the window is always in the same spot. Stuff like that was much harder to do back then than obviously it would be now with just digital framing. I mean, it really had to be a lot more precise. And then once we're on the window, you see the window, the light goes out, and when it comes back on, the window's in the exact same space, but we're now equal distance on the other side of the window looking back at it, and Hearst is laying in bed in front of it. Just the care to line those things up was remarkable and incredible. And I think a lot of filmmakers just saw that kind of stuff, and that's why film number one art, you know.
And how the snow, if you have the overlay of the snow inside of the room, and then all of a sudden you're inside of a snow globe, and then all of a sudden the snow globe, you're outside of the snow globe. He releases or drops it onto the floor rather, and it breaks. Or not, it doesn't break. It rolls down, and then you see his nurse come in, but you see her come in through the reflection of the snow globe glass in this kind of fisheye lens, which I don't know how they even achieved that. I mean, it's just it's absolutely extraordinary. And this is the first 60 seconds of the film.
It's so rewatchable for the reason. One of my favorite shots that you and I have talked a lot about is the shot where they're setting him up as a child and telling his backstory, and his mother is sort of signing him away to live with someone else, and it's this elaborate shot. And I mean, it's a scene that did not call being elaborate, but the fact it's done so incredibly. So we see him playing in the snow. Then the camera pulls back and we realize we're looking through a window, and his mom there looking out through the window, him playing in the snow. Then it pulls back more, and we're in the cottage with her, and it pulls back more. It goes through a table which they had separated and pushed together last minute, right when the camera cleared that space. She sits down and then writes at the table. She's in the zone as an actress. She's incredible. Agnes Moorehead plays his mom, and of course, that, and Nora from V.
Yes.
She's
often
like,
credited as being the best actress in the film too, or giving the best performance.
Really good. And you kind of miss it, but like her concentration when they're moving tables and doing all this stuff, they move the table into view like right when the camera clears it in two halves into one, and he sits down and writes at it. It's so seamless. Like her concentration in the scene is really good. And then the way the camera is looking at them through the window, and then they move outside around, the camera pulls back, and then it's like, I think I told you it's kind of like a God's eye view. Like the stuff that happens is so well choreographed and orchestrated that it feels like like a God's eye view. Like you just have this power in the scene to kind of go anywhere you want with the camera. That stuff was not done back then to that level. We see a lot more of that, sense, but
Yeah.
very cool. So
It's something that a modern audience is going to take for granted, and I took most of the movie for granted. And it's not until you really rewatch it, and it's not until you like read about it, and you shared that with me about how they split the table to get the camera to be able to pan all the way back and then put it back together seamlessly. I mean, it's incredible to think that that was done when it was done. And one of the things I
yeah,
noticed when I rewatched it again was in that scene when you're in mom and dad's house and Charlie's basically getting signed away to Mr. Thatcher. The framing too, because when they do make it to the dining room table and she's signing the paperwork, you have like her here, you have Mr. Thatcher here, you have kind of dad right here, and then in the center, the window is always in the center. You never stop seeing Charlie Kane playing outside in the snow through the
right.
window. And what I noticed today particularly was you can also, the audio stays on Charlie. You can always hear him vocalizing and playing throughout that entire scene, which
So
would be, it's totally unnecessary, but it's such an
right.
interesting choice.
And they have, of course, the narrator who works for the paper, who is constantly trying to figure out what Rosebud is throughout the film,
Mhm.
write about it, and he's always like in the bottom left with his back to the audience, like in shadow. So he kind of represents us moving through the story and inquiring as we go. But also, other people assume that role. There's like roles given in this film, and they're given like spaces on the screen, say like bottom right, or and then when any given person assumes a specific type of role, i.e., the listener or the viewpoint of the audience. I mean, the levels on which some of this stuff was thought out was
Yeah, I'm gonna have to take a sip of wine because yes, you're taking me to church.
so great. Yeah. And I gotta give it up to the old age makeup. Like it's so incredibly seamless. Orson ages from like his age, like 20s, all the way to death, basically, and to an old man. And there's many makeups for him. There's not just like young, middle, old. There's like in between parts too. There's a great scene where he's at the breakfast table with his first wife in the film, and it shows throughout time as he's getting older, and it just keeps cutting back to them, and they both keep aging, but very subtly and believably. And it's another God's eye view moment. This coming from an atheist, but you get the point. It's like it's like you're really you
we
have
also die. Yeah.
right. It's so cool, and I love Orson's performance in this. I think it's not unlike. I mean, maybe this is like a disservice to Orson to say this, but there's threads, that from modern day performances that lead back to this. I think
Yeah.
of Leonardo DiCaprio in Wolf of Wall Street, the way that he's rises up and does these different things, and the ego of it, and the ego of Xanadu and the empire that is built and all this stuff. And but it's definitely like a tour de force performance like that. And you almost lose sight of like how incredible it is what Orson is doing, because he's giving this like once in a lifetime level of performance in this film, and he's also directing it, produced it, was heavily involved in the screenplay. I mean, so he's jumping back and forth as the director and the lead star of this film. That is not easy to do. And he's keeping concentration, he's keeping context for each scene for himself. Of course, he knows the material inside and out, but it's just not the easiest thing to do. And it's an incredible performance. And
Do you want to know what I was doing at 24?
right? Any
It
no,
wasn't producing, directing, and acting in the greatest movie of all time. I'll tell you that. I,
yeah,
I I want to say this in term. I want to talk about just like a couple other shots that struck me, and I want you to chime in if you have any thoughts on them. And I'd love to go into some of like the quotes and some of the like story. But you mentioned just very quickly, you mentioned Wolf of Wall Street and Leo's performance and just that story in general. That actually had not dawned on me until I was reading a New Yorker article, you know, bougie bitch. I was reading a New Yorker article on the movie earlier, and it's because Martin Scorsese has famously said this is in his top 10 films of all time. The specific scene in Citizen Kane where Orson is, or excuse me, Charlie, is hosting a celebratory dinner for his newspaper staff, and there's, you know, the debauchery's got the band and the sexy ladies and, you know, all of this. Martin Scorsese specifically took in Wolf of Wall Street, took inspiration from that to create that scene where Jordan Belfort brings in like the little people and like the debauchery in the office was an homage to that, which just, this movie's so effing prolific. But if I may, there's a couple of shots that also blew my mind. Early on in the first act, you see the rain falling down on this glass ceiling where we're about to meet his second wife, or excuse me, his mistress, Susan, for the first time. And you see rain falling down, and the camera goes through the glass into the bar where she's seated.
First, the sign. So first, we're flying through the sky, and then we see the bar that she's a lounge singer in, I guess, fall into like a low level type of existence.
Yeah.
And anyway, the sign, you know, featuring her, it's built to move apart, just like that table we were talking about. So you don't notice it at all, but the camera is able to fly directly through a hole in the sign, like about this big. And we know how big cameras are and were back then. So they just built it to move apart and dissolve through some glass, and a high angle inside cuts to a high angle inside.
It's insane. It's 1940. It's insane.
Yeah, so great.
The other shot, well, two others I want to mention, and then we'll move on. There's a shot in the third act where they're at Xanadu, Susan and Charlie, and you know, the marriage or the affair has devolved, and she's doing her puzzles, and the camera basically is a shot of the castle, an exterior shot of Xanadu, and then it fades or dissolves, I guess, to her doing a puzzle, and it's just a seamless. I mean, it's just how you don't get a transition like that today.
Yeah, I was thinking about the dissolves. So if you watch a lot of old film in high resolution like I do, you're going to notice that when they do those fades, the quality drops just for the duration of the fade itself, because that effect was like sent to a lab or whatever to create the effect and then splice back in.
Okay.
Actually, let me backtrack. Let me be a little more specific. So when they're restoring the film for like a Blu-ray, say, they use the best materials possible. So they'll use like actual camera, but they don't have a negative per se for that that transition. So
right.
often it's looking like less quality. So I don't know how they did it, but that never happens in this film. Like if you watch it, it's available on HBO Max right now. Go watch it. Or where Prime.
It's $3 rental on Prime.
Or you can get the Blu-ray like I have, which I love. But yeah, the quality never drops on any of those type of shots. So I'd love to know more about that, but it's very interesting. I'm very used to certain things that you notice a lot quality-wise from older films that you just don't notice. And I think it's down to like workflow and how they created it, and how they always went like that extra step to make sure it was perfect. And you see that films like 2001: A Space Odyssey, which still looks so amazing and holds up. Like the special effects still hold up today, and it's because they went like as far as they really went as far as they could go to make it look as good as possible back then.
And again, these are things that we take for granted. We just take them for granted. But you had mentioned offline also to pay attention to the scene where the reporter, who is basically the representative of the audience in this narrative, is trying to figure out what the hell Rosebud means, and we're going to get to that obviously. But he goes to the Thatcher archives, Thatcher being the gentleman who was the Charlie was in his charge. He was his caretaker. And this gentleman goes into this beautiful open space, this almost mausoleum, huge hall, and you see this beam of light hit the table where he's going to be able to flip through the journals or whatever. And it's
first of all, the size of the that the camera's moving through, it makes you feel small as like an audience member watching.
Yes.
The scale is incredible. The fact that they were able to do that, which he would not have been able to if he didn't have that, the budget that he was able to have for this film. But the fact that you have that scale and you move through, and then you have a lighting choice that's that strong. Yeah, it's incredible. It's like a visual feast for someone that's really into film.
And there's a scene in I guess it's the second act, where Jed, his best friend, Jedediah, is confronting him after Charlie basically decides to betray him and say, you cannot write an accurate review of my girlfriend's operatic, disastrous, hot mess dumpster fire performance. I'm going to write it myself and save face. And you see Orson, you see Charlie at his typewriter, and then you see Jed walk up from the background into the foreground, and the camera is just right on Charlie the entire time.
Those were filmed separately. Yes. So him walking up to that banister was filmed with
no
completely blacked out. Then they developed the blacked out part with another shooting him separately so that they could get it exactly how they wanted it, which is wild, which is crazy. You never notice that, by the way. I mean, it's completely seamless. Another thing you'll see in old films when they do two separate shots like that, you'll see one of them shake. Like if the camera isn't perfect or the film isn't threaded perfectly, you'll notice, especially like in older films that don't have a full restoration, you'll see like when the titles come up that they move around a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So the shot isn't perfectly stabilized. Well, those two shots had to be like perfectly stable with each other. So like an extra level of care has to go into setting those up and just making sure that they match perfectly. It blows my mind.
This is the moment where I just sit in awe of your knowledge, because you're blowing my mind right now. This is so amazing. That's incredible.
Yeah.
All right. I don't even know where to go next, because I'm just trying to process the truth that you just gave us.
I was going to say this too about something you mentioned. It's interesting. You were saying how much you liked the singer's performance, his second wife in the film, her performance in the film, and how he's constantly trying to build her up. And of course, there's a GIF that's really popular where he's clapping like really hard for her, and he ends up like trying to make the clap happen. I mean, like clapping happen for her, and it's like at the end of the day, he's the only one clapping, and it's such a great, rich scene of like, wanting to force something, because when he got together with her, of course, her name, the word singer was in quotes around her name because they think of her as a professional singer. So he spent like the rest of his life trying to make her a professional singer that takes quotes off around the word singer. But sometimes you can't force things, and it's just seeing him struggle to try to force it with money and power. Sometimes you see the most powerful person on the planet and can't force something to happen if it's just not going to happen. But all of that's very interesting, and her performance is really interesting because she plays it in such a way where it's not like she's just playing a bad singer. She plays
Right.
just bad enough. You know what I mean? And it's such a fine line because it's almost easy. It's almost hard to play like a bad singer. You
Right. Right.
thing, or to like play it without playing it, really bad. So the fact that she's almost passable and she's working with that vocal trainer, that coach, and yeah, the way she plays not being a good singer it's like such a fine line there, and I think she chose exactly the right place on the dial to perform that. And it's so interesting too, that amazing shot where her show opens and then the camera lifts off the ground and goes up through the rafters, and you get that review, that instant of her from the two behind the scenes guys up in the rafters, and the one guy holds his nose.
Stinks, yeah.
Yeah, and same shot happens again, but from behind her the second time, where the view is out to the audience, but it's the same shot, everything going on around the same, and it's amazing.
That I was reading, and I'll link the articles again in the description, that I was reading a lot of this stuff, and it's just so effing eye-opening because they were talking about, now that Mank has come out, and did Mank write it? Did Wells write it? Who did what? And Mankiewicz, having had a history of writing comedies before he got his hands on this project, they were suggesting that all of those comedic moments in Kane that's Mank's touch. And Orson, like Charlie Kane trying to like get the audience to give her the applause, and it just ain't working. Or her vocal coach in the little box at the front of the stage giving her cues. It's just so good. And Dorothy Commodore, who plays Susan, I think, to your point, does such an extraordinary job. She does a really good job of like playing like the innocent, ingenue, like I'm just having an affair with the newspaper tycoon, and to full blown like I love this man and I'm trying to be authentic and be an artist and nobody's taking me seriously, to completely broken woman. Like she does all of it in under, I mean, she's probably on screen for what, 30 minutes? She's giving it all to you. Magnificent.
Yeah. It's incredible. I love all of the performances in this film. It's hard to find like a bad performance in this film. I don't think there is one.
I don't think there is either. And I actually, speaking of performances, I really love the character of Jedediah, Charlie's best friend. I love the betrayal that takes place. I specifically, to your earlier point about how well done the makeup is in this movie, when the reporter is trying to figure out what Rosebud means and he's interviewing people, he finally catches up with Jed at the old age home, and Jed is in his old age makeup, and he's in like a robe and like a scarf, and he's got like a visor on. It's a look. And
if you look at that actor when he did finally reach that age, it looked a lot just like that old age makeup.
Oh, really?
That's how well it was done. They really got it right. Yeah.
What's his name? Something John Cotton or Tom Cotton or something. Yeah, so good.
Joseph Cotton.
Thank you. Well, did you want to? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
He at the old age home gets one of those glorious shots where the background fades to black. So they fade everything out, but they keep the light illuminating him, so that when the shot transitions, everything that has gone black is now invisible. Basically, it's like green screen, what they were trying to do. But so everything black in the next shot goes away, and he's still there, lingering. And it's just so cool how they did that shot.
he also, in my opinion, has some of the best. He's arguably my favorite character in the narrative, but he also has some of the best dialogue and quotes.
You brought
But
my attention a lot more because I think I never like focused in on him that much until you were saying this, and now that you say it, it's enriched my viewing experience.
well, I mean, it's only because he's Charlie's best friend, and he's been there like not since the beginning of his life, but since the
Right.
beginning of his rise, and through his kind of fall, and yet he still doesn't even know what Rosebud is. But
Right.
he delivers a couple of lines, and specifically when the reporter or the journalist is interviewing him and trying to figure out what Rosebud means, he delivers a couple of gems here. What does he say? Um, he says Charlie wasn't brutal. He just did brutal things. Okay, hello. Um, he also says, where is it? He talks about how memory is like the cruelest thing that can happen to the human experience. I'm trying to find the exact quote. Um, but I mean, he has such insight and such, he's also feels to me a little bit like a representative of the audience, like
Yeah.
how we feel.
Yeah. How Kane makes people feel.
Oh yeah, one of the greatest curses that was ever inflicted on the human race, memory was.
I
Come
love.
on. What
Yeah.
are you
I
doing?
love. There's a lot of good quotes. Another one is when Kane says, "If I hadn't been very rich, I might have been a really great man."
Mm-hmm.
And Walter Thatcher says, "Don't you think you are?" And he says, "I think I did pretty well under the circumstances."
Right.
So it
Do
just
you agree with that? Do you agree with that? Do you think that Charlie did the best that he could, or do you think that given his circumstances, like there's no other avenue you can go when you're given that much money and that much, you know what I mean? Like you're gonna end up.
I don't think there's no other avenue one could go, but I think there was no other avenue this particular person could have gone. And so I think there's a lot of truth in what he said. I think that he was acknowledging that he started off like ambitiously trying to have like a code of morals for the paper and all these things, and really not care about money, not care about amassing a fortune, all those things. Really try to like fight the man type thing.
Yeah.
Um, then I mean, it just deteriorates, and he just becomes so corrupt. And I think that happens very often. So it feels very true. I'm not saying that someone could never escape it, because I think you could, but I think certain people, I think it's almost impossible for certain people, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. And it's interesting because when upon my first rewatch, we were rewatching it as a group, I was so struck by like Charlie's self-awareness in the first act of the movie, because this is a rags to riches story. This isn't somebody that was born into wealth, right?
Right.
So, granted, he had money very early on, but he wasn't.
Yeah.
You get it. My
He-
point is to say that like in the first act of the movie, there's so much dialogue where Charlie is self-aware, and again to your point is trying to almost abdicate his own throne. He's trying to sabotage it. I mean, when
right. Like
Thatcher. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
he's like, oh, you're just burning through your money, and he's like, oh well, yeah, I'm losing about $1 million a year. At this rate, I'll have to close this paper down in about 60 years. And he's 24, so I mean, he could go his whole life with he didn't care about them. It wasn't about the money. Yeah.
Right. That was the quote. You just were great minds think alike. You literally were mind melding right now, because that's exactly what I was going to reference. And it's crazy because he does, in my opinion, or the way the story unfolds, it feels like a really abrupt 180. because the movie's only an hour and 50 minutes, and it packs so much in, and it just feels like he goes from being this kind of advocate for the 99% and advocate for the proletariat to being the bourgeoisie and the 1%, like on the turn of a dime, except for the dining table scene with his first wife, which you referenced earlier with the makeup, where it flashes forward in time. They're at the same dining room table, and you see them deeply in love, having a conversation, smitten over each other, and then it dissolves into another moment in the future where she's like a little agitated with him and like, I want my man back, and then it dissolves further, and then they're just very bitter, and then the last one is like they're not even talking, they're just eating in silence.
Yeah.
So you see like the depth, like the how things are devolving, but it's just for somebody that was so self-aware and so with his declaration of principles with the newspaper, really trying to be the voice of the working man, to do such a hard right is so heartbreaking, especially, with our 2020 glasses. It's like, is this, is there no other way the story ends?
Right. It is sad in the context of a film that we're emotionally invested in. But I mean, you see it happen all the time, right? So it definitely happens. Another thread from this film to modern day is definitely Elon Musk, I feel, because I mean the character of Kane in the story, there's so many parallels to Elon. Um, Being outsider coming in, he was the outsider coming into the newspaper. Musk was an outsider coming into space and technology and energy, and just the pressure and the way it changes you or like affects you, and what it takes to keep it going, and having all that energy in his youth to like launch all of these things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be interesting to see how his story plays out, but hopefully not like Kane's. But there's so many people in modern day things that I feel have threads right back to Citizen Kane.
Yeah. And we're seeing it, seeing it with a lot of people. Elon's a really good example. He's for me somebody where I can't quite tease out if he's good or evil, or if he's just gray and that's just the way the world works, which I mean, I do think the world is gray, but I haven't quite made my mind up about Elon, and I probably never will in my lifetime. But it's interesting because it just furthers the point that this is the greatest movie for me, because it's commenting on all of this shit, and
Right.
it's prophetic. I mean, even to the scene in the first act where he um, decides to start the Inquirer, and he's assembling his staff, and he says, we're going to do news 24 hours a day. And
Yeah.
it's like, that's not done. And look at Fox News, Roger Ailes.
Yeah. Look at the
Crazy.
24-hour news cycle that we're all living in. And that's relatively new that people started talking. I mean, in our life, in our century, it's relatively new that people started saying 24-hour news cycle, and they said it basically in this film, which is wild and crazy.
It's insane.
When
And
they such a there's so many prophetic scenes like that.
it's too scary, really. Like when you rewatch the movie a couple times over, it's too scary. It's too eerie, and
Yeah.
it not to beat a dead horse, but it just, how did a 24-year-old white male in 1939, 1940, how was he so woke? You know what I mean? Like where are these men? I
I,
would like one.
I mean, Mank's older, and Mank was really the storyteller behind it, and I just think Kane was, Wells was a prodigy. He was a child prodigy in terms of like his talent, drive, ambition, his multifaceted, how multifaceted his talent was, that he was able to step into so many different areas, and I think Stanley Kubrick was a lot like that too, where he was able to have oversight in, say, the area of cinematography a lot more than other directors. He just was really talented in these different areas of film production other than just directing it and making it happen. He sort of had his fingers in lots of different pots and was able to move in and out of those areas really well and sort of competently. So that's what like enamors me about Wells so much. But I think Mankiewicz did an incredible job with certain things like you just mentioned about the news is 24 hours a day. Like that's like mind blowing.
Yeah. That really shook me when I rewatched it for the first time. I was just,
Yeah.
and there's in the very first moments of the movie, you see like these little kind of silent film titles as they're giving you kind of context for newsreel. Thank you.
Yeah.
For who Charlie Kane is as a newspaper magnate, and one of the things that they quote him as saying is, "I have always been and will always be an American. Like at my core, I'm just an American." And again, like talk about like how precious this movie is for where we're living, where all of these people with ultimate power and ultimate resources are doing some unsavory things, and
right.
The whole absolute power corrupts absolutely trope. You know, it's so, there's so much in this movie. I mean, you could do a whole class on this movie, and
yeah,
I know I'm kind of getting to like the deadline, so I want to shut up and let you say whatever you want to say, because I could talk about this for like another hour easily.
Oh, I know. No, I was just gonna say that quote you just mentioned about America kind of not like Elon Musk either. I mean, he moved here from South America and then to Canada and then down to here, but his goal was his focus. He was always like singularly focused on being a success in an American way in America. Like his goal was always to get to America to make things happen for himself, and that's another like direct correlation to the Kane character, I think, because they both felt like they wanted to operate within the American system and make things happen, and that certain things were only possible in America.
Right. Yeah. I think you're hitting the nail on the head right there. We are the epitome of capitalism, and only certain things are achievable if you're operating within that paradigm, and only in the modern West, where capitalism is the reality, can people like Jeff Bezos exist. You know, we're the only part of this simulation or this reality, whatever you believe to be going on, that really allows for this level of whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Right. Well, did you want to touch anything else on Mank, which we just watched, which is on a Netflix original film, and how it kind of, I don't know, we could just touch on that to kind of wrap this up, because I feel that since we just watched that, and
yeah, Mank is a must see for any cinephiles, obviously Citizen Kane fans, but more specifically, it's such a Fincher, whether or not you like the movie or not, Fincher's accounting of these events are his own, obviously, but they're very good at one thing, if nothing else, in my opinion, which is depicting the unbelievable and inseparable relationship between Hollywood and politics, and how both have created a power structure and inform the content that we are fed, and it just does such a good job of articulating that, whilst being comedic and witty. And there's the one quote I wanted to mention about Mank was when Mankiewicz is having a conversation with Mayer of MGM Studios, and Mayer says to him, "I'm not interested in educating our customers," when he's describing the product that they're producing, i.e. movies. And
Mm-hmm.
we're living that reality. Like,
Right.
movies, for the most part, are meant to be focus grouped and ad infinitum until they turn into Rise of Skywalker, and it's just a shit show.
Yeah.
And just a money making machine. And here again, we have an example of it, you know, having been orchestrated and manufactured to be just that from day
Yeah.
one.
That's such a great point. I'm glad you hit on that. And I thought so much about like the political climate of today as compared to then. And there's so many parallels that it was really scary. And yeah, how the fact that the people shown in Mank, like the higher you rose through the ranks of any given company or power structure, American power structure, the more powerful people got, the more political power they got, the more they wielded it, the more conservative they got, the more right wing, I guess, they got. And it was just like this really bizarre confirmation of things that I've seen a lot of. But and the stuff with Hertz basically was kind of crazy. But also it kept me thinking, this is one of those times when you're watching an account that's, like we said, not a documentary. It's very much stylized. It's entertainment, and it's a stylized version of accounts. So it's Fincher and his screenwriter's version of accounts. And I just think it's so important to keep that in mind, because otherwise people can easily walk away thinking that this is exactly how everything happened, when we don't really know. But it's still so exciting and interesting to watch. It doesn't take anything away from it, but I'm always just like cautious in those areas.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, Citizen Kane, you talked about the book, and we'll link it in the description that you're going to read about the making of Citizen Kane. I mean, that's one of many books that have been written about the movie and about Orson. And there's books and articles written about Mankiewicz and the entire production and the history of RKO Studios. And I mean, what you learn in just reading like two articles that are easily Googleable is that's not a word, Googled, is that there's so much context that needs to be taken into account with this. And no one person, I mean, that's why people write scholarly articles about this movie and about Mank and about Wells, because no one will ever, I don't think, know who really made this movie what it is. You know, was it 50-50 Wells Mank? Was it 70-30? Were there other players? You know, we don't know. But that's what's beautiful about it, and that's why it stays in the top 100, which is no easy feat wherever you land on that list. And it's just such a it's just so rich. I mean, and it's genre bending. You know, the opening scene feels like horror, and then it's like part detective, part gothic. It's commentary on I mean, it's all of these things.
Film noir was really influenced by it too, among German expressionism as well. Before Kane, we got to say, but Kane was one of the first really to push film noir like that hard too. And I feel like a lot of film noir took from Kane, Citizen Kane as well, throughout the 50s. But we were talking about Mank, and the cast is so great in Mank as well. And I love, like you were saying, that this amazing scene. I don't know if you want to walk us through it, when they're talking about the Nazis at Hearst Castle.
I would be delighted.
Yeah.
Okay, so flashback to Herman Mankiewicz, who is in real life, in real history, and as Fincher is depicting it in Mank, actually a friend of the real Hearst and his mistress, played by Amanda Seyfried. Somebody help us out. I don't know how to ever pronounce her last name, but she shines in Mank. And he's at this like dinner party, and they're socializing, and they're having like conversation, and it's the 1940s, and they're talking very casually before Hitler becomes full-blown Hitler about Hitler's going to become Hitler. He's about to be the worst person ever. And the rest of the folks are just like in disbelief. And you have this Hollywood starlet mistress ingenue, again played by Amanda Seyfried, who's basically telling people, no, he's about to be the worst person ever. And she says, and I quote, he was a creeper when she met him. Like, I mean, do you really need anything else? Just, okay, from now on, textbooks, when you get to World War II, just need to say Hitler was a creeper. And that's all I need to know. But it was so comedically
schooling them
well
too.
Executed.
Yeah, and Mank schooling them about, no, this about to be bad. Like, this is not good. I mean, it just goes to show you the casual ignorance in some of these high society circles, and with regard to foreign affairs and politics and all of these important things.
And I would argue, not just in a high society, but everywhere. I mean, because the only thing that makes Mank's timing and this whole thing with Citizen Kane coming back into the forefront of popular culture right now so relevant is because of the hellscape that is 2020 and the absolute denial of what somebody like Trump and his people that buy into his rhetoric and his narrative, like how quickly that is leading or has led to World War II like events. We have people in cages. We're not going to go there right now, but I'm just using that to make a point that we're all in denial until we're being put on boxcars headed to Auschwitz, right? I think Mank does an extraordinary job of doing articulating this while being very funny, very witty, and just the acting is extraordinary from Gary Oldman and from Amanda Seyfried.
Yeah, and I think that the as you move up through the social circles, it becomes more and more dangerous to be ignorant because you're donating more and more money to your cause, and you're having more and more power and influence.
And that's a full circle moment because we know that Hearst played in those circles, and he knew these people. He knew Hitler. He knew these people. Watch season 4 of The Crown. We know that everybody was friends with Hitler until like the 11th hour when it was uncool to be friends with Hitler. It's crazy.
Yeah, not unlike Trump, with a lot of the Koch brothers and all these different people. Yeah,
exactly.
It's that draw the line. The kids in cages was not enough, so it's got to be like a full genocide before they turn on Trump.
Well, speaking of that, I have one thing I want to close on, unless you have anything else that you want to say about either movie.
I'm good. So, go for it.
The movie opens with one word, and it's Charlie Kane on his deathbed saying the word rosebud, and the entire plot of the movie is predicated on people trying to figure out what the hell that word meant. And you do not find out what that word means or references rather until the last shot of the film. Now, the fact that they actually tell you what that word references, I think, is just very satisfying and very brilliant, and it's a very tender thing because it reminds you that however vile and evil somebody becomes, they're still always human. And I try and think about that when I hate Trump or when I hate Hitler, or anybody. I mean, go down whatever your list is, it's just such a tender reminder to to be cognizant of the fact that
Such a great point.
that to have empathy
Yeah.
in even in the most minuscule way, if you can, you know,
Oh my
Hitler
God.
was born Hitler. I know this is probably going to be like a controversial thing, but I'm just using this as an extreme example on purpose to make the point that people become these things, in my opinion, and
Yeah.
we help make them those things.
Right. There's a great documentary on HBO Max called Crazy Not Insane that touches on exactly that. And it goes into uh, and Ted Bundy was very famous in constantly defending his family and saying, "Oh, I didn't come from a bad family. Don't try to say that. My family was perfect and this and that." And then the more that we dug into it, that was completely not true, and it was
Right.
dumpster fire. And just I never knew that until I saw this documentary. I thought, well, I guess maybe some people are just like inherently evil, and that's bullshit.
Yeah.
Is inherently evil in that way, and we become things, just like what you're saying. I agree 100%. But I want you to watch that documentary.
Oh, I absolutely will, and I'll link it in the description. Ted
Yeah.
Bundy's just very quickly, you know, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer. I mean, these are two folks that are, you know, from our home state of Florida. You know, I don't currently live there, but it's interesting that you referenced him because it reminds me that Xanadu, where Charlie Kane decides to build his monument to himself, is in Florida on the Gulf Coast, and Florida is also where Disney chose to build the monument to himself,
And Mar-a-Lago.
and Mar-a-Lago, and also if you've ever read the book Fast Food Nation, which I highly recommend for anyone to read, it's just really good U.S. history. It does talk about Walt Disney's ties with the SS Party. Not to suggest that Disney was a Nazi, that's a whole different conversation, but it goes back to that earlier point of when you're operating in these 1% realms where everybody has their hand on the button and everybody has power, everybody is you know, you're operating with people that I'm losing how I want to articulate this. You're swimming in murky waters. There's always going to be relationships amongst people of power at that level that are going to get very, 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 very murky and nebulous. And I just want to tie it back. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, interject real quick with our cancel culture that's going on. That nothing is ever put in context. It could be something that someone did 25 years ago that that was literally a different society when they did that, and they were literally a teenager or whatever. Nothing is given proper context, and I feel like it's a shortcut that people are taking to leave context out because it is such a complicated conversation to have that conversation, but it needs to be a part of the reality that we live in.
Context is everything, whether you're talking about entertainment or history, specifically history, and it's important to know. I mean, I love Walt Disney more than pretty much anything on planet Earth, and I have to reconcile the fact that he probably knew Adolf, and if he didn't, he at least money was funneled from a point A to a point B. Maybe without his knowing the what it would end up becoming, but in early on goings on, you know, I have to reconcile with that as a fan and as, you know, whatever. So context is everything, and I appreciate you bringing that up. And you know, just to kind of bring it back to Charlie Kane and Orson Welles' commentary on all of this, which again, this is the greatest movie ever made because you could talk about this movie all day, every day, and you would just continue to learn and continue to be delighted and entertained. But going back to my favorite character, Jedediah, when he's being interviewed by the journalist in the nursing home, he says, quote, all Charlie really wanted out of life was love. That's Charlie's story, how he lost it. He just didn't have any to give except for himself. And
Which is what
it's
the sled called Rosebud represented, right? Was the lost childhood and the lost love from his mother, which was really the only true love, like true love that he knew. Yeah.
and isn't that just the recipe for every narcissistic person that's ever risen to power?
Right.
Is they maybe they didn't get enough love, and so they're starved for it, and they're getting it from all of the wrong places, and in the process they're exploiting and destroying everything in their path to get it.
Yeah.
I don't know. You guys comment below, like, subscribe. Any closing thoughts on the
No,
greatest movie ever made?
I think this was epic. Like the fact that we didn't limit ourselves in our conversation. We were in different areas. And I agree 100% that that's something a film this rich can um, really provide the ground to do that. Yeah, pretty amazing. So I don't know what else to say.
I'm just very infatuated with Mr. Wells, and just, man, if you really didn't think you were doing enough with your life, don't learn about Orson Welles because you're gonna feel like shit. Um, yeah, and I really want to watch the movies that followed, because apparently
Yeah,
they're extraordinary as well. And some critics have argued that, I mean, he never made a bad movie, and some of his subsequent films are even better than Kane.
yeah, it's like but in a way it's like where do you go from here if that's like if you reach a high like Citizen Kane so early.
Right.
His trajectory after that is very interesting.
Yeah.
And kind of somewhat downward, I think, but definitely there are high points. The Third Man is a good film, and there are several great films, excellent films. Lady from Shanghai. There's some really good ones, but I always go back to Kane. I think Kane is best work.
Yeah.
Personally.
Well, with that, I guess we will say thank you as always for joining us. Subscribe, like, please comment, and we'll be back again soon with some more Nightmare on Elm Street realness and other delights. But thank you guys. Rosebud, cheers, and we will see you on the other side.
See you on the flip side.